Welcome to part two of our August 2018 News Geezers Lunch. Next, as we remembered 1968, an interview our Brian Bland, an AP retiree, did with the late great AP writer Bob Thomas on the 30th anniversary of the Robert F. Kennedy assassination. Bob was at the Ambassador Hotel that night, and Brian took him back there. Thank you, Brian, for this audio.
We're standing about where the senator was speaking that night on to Chicago, is that right?
That's right. He was exulting in his victory in the California primary for the presidential election. And he stood right here to a vast and cheering crowd filled with a sprinkle of Hollywood personalities. And everyone was just enraptured with his speech, as always, like a Kennedy, very articulate. Then he disappeared behind the stage here, followed by all of his close associates, and that's where it happened.
What thoughts are you having when you stand here 30 years later?
Not very pleasant ones. It was a traumatic affair for a reporter. And I was months getting past the shock whenever I heard a firecracker or a backfire. I would flinch because I had been so close to it. And it still is very haunting to come back to this place, which now is just a shell of what it was, and to see, this is where history was made. First thing I heard were some reports. It sounded like balloons popping, pop, 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 like that. And I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe they were celebrating. But then I heard these shrieks and yells and screams, and somebody shouted, "He's been shot." And so I rushed into the pantry, and I saw this collection of people just in a frenzy. I noticed Rosie Greer and Rafer Johnson fighting with somebody, trying to hold him down, and everybody was looking down at the floor, and I couldn't see what they were looking at because of the crush. So I jumped on some, what I found out later was a pile of waiters' trays, and I was able to get some elevation and look down, and I saw the senator on the floor, his eyes open but staring sightlessly, and blood on his head. I jumped down and ran into the press room and was going to dictate my story there. And the phones were dead. Somebody had turned them off. I panicked, but fortunately I knew the hotel. I'd spent my youth here, and I'd seen many, many stars at the Coconut Grove, and I knew there was a row of phones out in the lobby, and I rushed out there, grabbed the first one, and called the office.
That was the late, great Bob Thomas of the Associated Press, and I thank Brian very much. Brian will be up here shortly with some other memories. And finally, some of you will know Ernie Chacon, who has been here. Lou's nodding his head, he remembers him well. Long time KNBC and NBC News photographer in Los Angeles. Ernie was on the crew that got an exclusive with Sirhan Sirhan minutes after he was sentenced to death. This occurred at the Hall of Justice in downtown LA. NBC News at the time hired a still photographer to take pictures of this interview in progress. The photographs were found by Ernie very recently, and they're quite remarkable. I don't think you've ever seen them. Ernie now lives in Tucson, Arizona. Travel has become difficult for him, so he's not here. But I wanted him to be here, so I called him and I said, if we record a telephone conversation, I could use that sound under these pictures. And he said, fine. So we did, and this was the result.
What we did was NBC had exclusive rights to interview Sirhan Sirhan right after he was convicted. He was given a death sentence, as you probably know. But we had an interview room all set up, and they were, and we had lit it and pulled all the cables and whatnot.
Where was this? Was this the old Hall of Justice?
Yes, the old Hall of Justice. The sheriffs escorted him into this room immediately after the trial, along with his attorneys. And they're probably, you might be able to see them, and there are about 15 sheriff's deputies making sure he doesn't squirm out the door. The way the pictures came into my possession was NBC had hired a photographer apparently, and about a month after the trial, someone slipped them into my inbox in the camera room. It was so fresh, the whole thing was so fresh that I really didn't pay much attention to them. I filed them away. And then, last week or two, we were going through, my wife and I were going through old photos, trying to reduce the load here. And lo and behold, there they were.
Ernie, thank you very much, and best wishes to you in Tucson. And I thank you for taking the time and also for sharing these pictures.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad to do it.
That was Ernie Chacon in Tucson, Arizona. I want to thank John Marshall because he facilitated this and brought me the pictures. In fact, he sent them to me while I was in Germany last month, but then I talked to Ernie. So thank you very much. Still on what happened at the Ambassador Hotel on awful June night in 1968. I'm going to have us listen to Boris Yaro. Boris is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer for the Los Angeles Times, now retired. Boris was in the pantry that night and got the definitive still of what had happened. David, can you put it up for us, please? You can leave the lights on here, Joel, it's fine. That was the front page of the LA Times, the street final, the morning after Kennedy was shot. The photograph on the front, and you've seen it in previous video that we've shown today, was taken by Boris Yaro. And give me a second, I'm going to bring this mic over to Boris, who has agreed to talk about it, and I think he'd be willing to take a couple of questions as well.
Where do we begin? I had gone to Ambassador Hotel shortly after seeing Kennedy won the election. And I wanted a picture for me, not the paper. And I got to walk into the embassy ballroom, and everybody was hanging around the exit from the kitchen, and I started to make a picture. Kennedy flew by. I mean, while he's walking by, somebody walked in front of him between me and the subject. And I hear a friend of mine, Richard Drew, Associated Press photographer, say, "Hey, Boris, you missed him." And I look up, and sure as hell, I had missed him. So I ran after him, and Kennedy, and I go up on top of the podium, and he started to talk and wanted to shot something. And I started yelling, "Bobby, give us a V. Give us a V." And I looked at Kennedy. He seemed somewhat irritated. And when he finished speaking, he went like this, about 3 seconds worth. No time to get a picture. So I ran after him back to the kitchen. And I'm staying right-hand side, and Kennedy is surrounded by well-wishers, kitchen personnel, and I'm trying to figure out how the hell make chicken salad out of you know what. And a time frame as I'm on one side of a freezer. Kennedy was on the other, and I tried to aim my camera. Every time I aimed my camera, somebody was in the way. Next thing you know, pop, pop, pop. And I was hitting face by the debris from the gun. And I'm thinking, some son of a gun set off firecrackers. Because I, as a child, played with firecrackers, and that's the effect you have. You're too close, boom. Then the crowd separated from Kennedy. Sirhan walked up unimpeded and began to shoot again. And I was totally frightened. No way to be in that situation. But I brought my camera up and then put it down around my neck, and somebody jumped Sirhan and brought him face down on the freezer and slammed his hand on top, freezer top. The revolver he had in his hand flew out, maybe foot and a half away from the hand. Sirhan was still reaching for the revolver. And I said, Bull, I don't want him to get the damn thing and shoot me. So I reached in underneath one of the two guys holding and grabbed the revolver by the butt and bring it back. And I turned my back on to the scene, and I'm looking at this revolver. And first, a lot of things are running through my mind. What the hell am I doing? And I interfered with crime scene. And the grip on the revolver was very warm, too warm to be done by a normal human being. Sirhan was excited, angry. His hand was that warm. Next thing you know, boom, somebody grabbed a revolver from me, and I looked and see a guy running in a sport coat, and I didn't recognize him, but I figured he was a cop, and let him have the gun. And I turned around, and Kennedy started sinking to the floor, and I moved in closer to try and make a picture. The ones you saw a couple of seconds ago, and I got 3 frames off, and I had to adjust for the darkness. Thank God there were TV crew there, and they flipped on their light, gave me the light I needed. And then I got a lady freaking out, and she grabbed my left coat sleeve, and she's pulling on me. Don't take a picture. Don't take a picture. I'm a photographer, and I'm not taking a picture. I said, God damn it, lady, this is history. Anyway, we made pictures. I got 3 more people surrounding the Kennedy laying on the floor. And my first thought was, get the hell out of there before a cop comes by and wants my film. They came by the next day at my office and grabbed the film. Anyway, that's the story. I'm sticking to it.
Boris, I do have two questions. Number one, what kind of camera was it?
What's Nikon?
Okay. It was not one of these that takes digital pictures.
No.
It was a film camera.
Film.
So here's my question. You took that film back down to Spring Street to the Los Angeles Times to get it into the soup.
I'm sorry?
You took it back down to develop it downtown.
Yeah.
At the time, I don't think you exactly knew what you had. When that came out of the developer and you put those prints into the fixer, it must have been jolting to see what you have. I'd love to have your impressions of that moment.
I'm trying to not relive the moment, but it made me sick. That's bottom line.
It's okay, Boris.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for being here. Such a pleasure and such an honor. Boris has been here in the past and dearly appreciated that he came here today and that Arnie Friedman brought him and Joel is going to take him home. Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Boris. I would like to ask now a series of people, and I hope there will be a lot. I'd like to start with Brian Bland and Warren Cheragino, and then open it up to the floor. There's a lot of you here with a lot of stories, a lot of history. Some of it, like you just heard with Boris, is pretty hard to remember and relate, but we'd all appreciate hearing what you've got to say. Brian Bland was at the time with the Associated Press. And Brian wants to speak about other topics in 1968 beyond the Kennedy assassination. So Brian, I'll leave it with you.
When the year began, I was a 26-year-old Army captain in Vietnam in a place called Cu Chi, about 15, 20 miles north of Saigon. And my title was Division Photo Officer, which meant that I had 8 or 10 combat photographers and 4, 5, 6 lab people that I looked after. My job was kind of a combination between an assignment editor and a photo editor. I guess you could make that comparison. The job was to keep in touch with the so-called maneuver battalions and their operation officers so that I would know where to send the young men that were working for me. And they were a great group, very hardworking people. So that was a kind of a journalistic enterprise. I had 7 weeks to go when 1968 began. I had 7 weeks left in country. I also had 7 weeks left to get out of the Army. And the other thing I was doing was occasionally writing articles for a literary magazine in the United States. It was a nice regional magazine, and I was very happy to be able to find the time to get about a half dozen articles published in the magazine. So late January, when the Pueblo was captured, the thing that was uppermost in our minds was whether we would, those of us who were about to rotate out, whether we would get extended. We thought for sure that something would happen with North Korea and we might well have to just stay in Vietnam for a while. That didn't happen, fortunately. The officers at that time in our signal battalion lived in what most of you may remember are hooches. Think of them as little huts and so forth. My hoochmate at the time was about 6 years younger than I was. He had turned down a music scholarship to go to college, and instead he went into OCS and became a lieutenant at the age of 18. By the time he got to Vietnam, he was 19, and at the time 68 rolled around, he had just turned 20. So when I left Vietnam, Jan moved down a couple of hooches to be with another friend of mine that I had known in the States. So Jan and Dan were both now in the same hooch. So I left on February 20th, a couple of days later, and I didn't even mention that the Tet Offensive, of course, had begun January 31st. And the Cu Chi base camp was well fortified and so forth, but we did get shelled and mortared occasionally. But when Tet began, it really got very intensive. And almost every day, every night, there was a lot of shelling going on, but the perimeter was safe. But anyway, when it came time for me to leave, Jan moved down to be with Dan, and 2 days after I left, one rocket hit the base camp that morning, only one, and it landed on their hooch. And Jan was killed immediately at the age of 20. Dan was wounded. I found out later when he wrote me at home. So I was, interestingly enough, I had been interested in the Bay Area. I had been to San Francisco a couple of times. Just before going to Vietnam, I was determined that I wanted to start my regular broadcasting career there, if at all possible. So I got discharged at the Oakland Army Terminal. And my girlfriend seemed happy to see me, and so we partied for 2 or 3 weeks. Then I decided I better let my parents know that I really, truly am back. So I went to my hometown to see them and saw friends that I hadn't seen in years, and we were partying and everything. And another couple of 3 weeks went by. That hometown was Memphis, Tennessee. So we were all sitting down to dinner on the evening of April 4th when the news came about Dr. King being killed. And of course, everybody went into shock immediately. A friend of mine who was a community relations director at the University of Memphis, as it's now called, was pressed into service by the Memphis Police Department. The police department at that time had no spokesman, no press person, so they called Charlie Holmes from the university to come and act as a spokesman. The reporters were pouring into town, obviously, and there was a memorial service or march for Dr. King that was coming up in a few days. And Charlie called me, and he says, I know you're home, and I know you've got a lot on your mind, but could you come down and help? So that's what I did, just on a voluntary basis. I went down to the police station for about 3 days and heard reporters around, answered phones, wrote some press releases, and so forth. The thing that I really remember about that short period of time was going back to my parents' home at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning and having to go through all the military checkpoints. There were young men dressed as I had been 40 days earlier, manning these checkpoints and checking out this little paper pass that the city had issued. And between Jan's death and the Tet Offensive and the Dr. King, it was really a bad time for all of us, of course. So the middle of the year, basically, I did move to the Bay Area, and I didn't know there was a lot I didn't know, but there were a couple of things I really didn't know about the Bay Area. One was most everyone in the country in the news business wanted to go there and work. The other thing I didn't know is that everybody who was in the news business in the Bay Area never planned to leave. So it was, for a guy who had, a couple of degrees and 3.5 years in the Army, I thought, and draft free, I thought I was going to do pretty well, but it took 4.5 months. And finally, of course, in the meantime, Bobby Kennedy got killed in LA about 3 days after I moved to San Francisco. But finally, in mid-October, Channel 2 in Oakland, KTVU, decided to take a chance on me as a news writer. And I was thrilled. I said, that's me crossing the bridge right now. The only studio I had gotten into in that 4.5 months before then was my studio apartment in San Bruno at $85 a month. And I got to Channel 2. The pay was a whopping $135 a week. but at least it let me keep my studio apartment, and the hours were such that I commuted. But I met some wonderful people at Channel 2, including the late Bob Brown. Bob and I were never real close, but every time our paths would cross over the years after that, he was always so gracious to me. And he's just a wonderful guy. Those of you who knew Bob certainly agree with that. I was going to mention another character that I met at Channel 2. I can't think of his name. Oh, Warren Cheragino. Whatever happened to that guy? Warren Cheragino. Yeah. So happy 50th anniversary, at least as far as I'm concerned. So the year wasn't quite finished with me yet. In December, my mom called and said my dad, at the age of 56, had a fatal heart attack. So 1968, the one good thing is that I did move to California and I did get a job. The rest of the year, I'd be happy to give it back to whoever would have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Hey, I'd love a show of hands. How many in this room have ever worked in any capacity for Warren Cheragino? Wow.
Thank God I didn't.
We all survived. Warren, come up.
This falls more into the category of general television news coverage, war stories, but it specifically addresses what happened after Bobby Kennedy was killed. As Brian mentioned, KTVU's studios are in Oakland, the transmitters in San Francisco. It's all part of the same market. But in those days, those of you who have been in the television news trenches know that there were the haves and the have-nots. The haves were the 15 O&Os in the entire country. That's all there was, and if they were there, that was the big leagues. After them came the network affiliated stations. And then, before CNN and the use of satellites for distribution of footage came upon the scene, the rest of us were the independents. And in this market, it was the people at 5, 11, 9, and 13. And in San Francisco, it was those of us at Channel 2. And we really had to scramble to at least keep up with the other three in San Francisco on local news. And as far as network and national, international news was concerned, it was just really, really hard. I mean, the old AP wire photos, UPI telephotos, and other day old news film would make its way into our newscasts, but that was a really tough project. In any event, this is what the situation was with us at KTVU. We did a half an hour Monday through Friday at 10 o'clock. That's all we did then. We had one assignment editor, me. We had two anchors who also doubled as field reporters who went out on stories in the afternoon. And then after they were souped over in San Francisco, the stories came back and then they cut them and put them on the show. We had one field reporter and 3 cameras. It was a really tough situation to be in. The night that Bobby Kennedy won the presidential won the California primary, I should say, I watched our show and saw on the other 3 stations what was going on in LA and went to bed. I had to be in there at 7:30 in the morning every day. For some reason that night I woke up in the middle of the night and I, for some reason, turned on the radio, and I never turned the radio on whenever I woke up in the middle of the night. And I heard the story, and then I ran in and watched it on television, and then I was thinking to myself, holy cow, what are we going to do tomorrow? So by the time I got to work, I'd figured out what we should do. And in the middle of the morning, I called one of our 2 anchors, a guy named Gary Park, who is now deceased. His partner was Stan Atkinson, and those of you who had anything to do with NBC in the late 60s knew Stan when he came down here to KNBC from Sacramento. I called Gary and said, look, there's only one thing I can think of that we need to do, and that is the Northern California headquarters for the Bobby Kennedy campaign was in Oakland. And I said, let's get down there and see what we can do. Well, he immediately started giving me a lot of grief about, well, that's a stupid idea. Why would we want to go down there? What's we can find there? Blah, 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 blah. I stood my ground and I said, that's what we're going to do. 2 hours later, he calls, we got a hell of a story. because it folded right in front of him. The timing was perfect. The people there were just beside themselves with grief. The place was packed with people because they didn't know where else to go to mourn. It was kind of like going to a mass shooting site and leaving teddy bears and flowers and things. So he ended up with a very good story on all these people who had been working there as volunteers, and of course, that was our lead that night. And that's really all that I wanted to say about this, just simply because we didn't have the resources to get the live feeds from Los Angeles or anything else, and that was the best we could do, and it turned out to be a fairly decent lead for our newscast. One other thing that happened that same year, although it's on a different subject, was the fact that, and again, this is one of these tug-of-wars between the assignment editor and the reporter, and that was when when Nixon was elected president, in 1968, he tapped Robert Finch, the Lieutenant Governor of California, to be Secretary of HEW. So then Governor Reagan had the opportunity to appoint another person to to finish out the term for Finch as Lieutenant Governor. He picked an relatively obscure congressman from down here, I believe San Marino, whose name was Ed Reinecke. So the next day, next morning, I called Carlton Cordell, our Dayside Street reporter, and I said, "Hey, Reagan's appointed this guy, Ed Reinecke, Lieutenant Governor. I want you to go out and do a story about him." He said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "I don't know, let's do a man on the street, find out what people think of him." "Oh, that's a stupid idea. Nobody will, blah, 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 blah." Same old stuff. 2 hours later, "We got a great story." And it was really a really good piece of television news, because most people lied. They didn't know who Reinecke was, but they would say things, "Oh yeah, he's a great guy. Yeah, oh yeah, he served the country well, blah, 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 blah." And ultimately, Reinecke came to the station on some other business one time, 6 months later or so, and we showed him the video, and he really loved it, so we gave him a dub of it. Anyway, that's my story, like Boris, and I'm sticking to it, but it was not easy to cover the Kennedy assassination, and of course the King assassination was just, we couldn't do anything other than the trouble that was starting in the streets in Oakland, but that's another story.
I'm going to insert myself in here with two thoughts. One of them I passed along at the last Geezer's lunch. At just after 12 a.m. on the day that Kennedy was assassinated, the ambassador, I was producing the KTLA election coverage. Sitting next to me in the infamous B-box was Michael Connelly, who we've talked about extensively, no longer with us. He was directing. And we got to the point where we were going to sign off. So we did, and we rolled the credits. Underneath the credits, which was on an old process called a videograph, I could see there was a commotion going on in the wide shot that we had of the Ambassador Hotel from the remote. And suddenly, I could hear the voice of Larry Shear on the internal system saying, "Don't go off the air, come back to me." And he said, "There's gunshots or something happening." So I told Michael, "Bail out." And I got into the ear of Stan Chambers, and I said, "We throw back down to Larry. I don't know exactly what's happening. Something's happening at the Ambassador room. I'm bailing out. We're going to stay on." And we were on all night. So that was my little contribution. The other thing is, something just happened that reminded me about how old I am, which is 74. And just a kid, I know, thank you. That's why I hold these things, because there's people older than me in the room. One of the best reporters I've ever worked with is Robert Penfold. Robert, stand up for a second. Robert has covered every major world event in the last 30 or 40 years with award-winning greatness, and is now the bureau chief for the Nine Network of Australia, and is in Los Angeles. We've been friends for many years. While the last speaker was on...
I was Bob's best man.
He was. He was. He was my best man. While the last speaker was on, I just went over and had a word to Bob. I said, do you want to speak about what you were doing in 1968? And he said, "No, I was in high school." Half killed me, man.
I was in 7th grade.
Oh.
Child bride.
I'm sure there's some others here who would like to speak. Jim, I know you would, and there's others, John, I'm sure, and others who would like to speak about 1968. Dan, and don't forget, before I go on, both Ken Davis with his book In Bed with Broadcasting and Dan Blackburn with his book of Presidents and Predators. And no, I'm not going to tell you what the predators are. You're going to have to buy the book. They're on the back selling books, okay? So, Jim Hattendorf.
I wasn't in the news business. I was in the Air Force, and I was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base on that day. And I was a brand new aircraft maintenance officer, and I went to bed, knew nothing was going on. 6:30 in the morning, I get a phone call, and it's the command post saying, "Hey, Lieutenant, we need you down here at the flight line immediately." And I said, "What the hell's going on?" They said, "Well, there's a B-52 that's slated to fly. We flew our B-52s for NASA at the time. They didn't have their own aircraft. And the crew chief grounded the airplane because of a hydraulic problem, and we need you to come down and sign off that red X because the pilot says he can go without that hydraulic system." And the official maintenance officer was a civilian who lived an hour away, and they said would never make it. So I jumped on some clothes, got in the car, turned on the radio, and they said, "Condolences are coming in from around the world for the Kennedy family." And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I was in college when Kennedy was shot. You know, I couldn't believe it. And then I listened more, and they said Bobby Kennedy had been shot. Well, I was a little concerned before I went down there whether I could do this. I was about like 2 months there on duty, and I downgrading a Red X and a B-52 and was going to fly. And I said, if somebody can shoot Bobby Kennedy, I can downgrade a Red X. And I charged down there, and I signed off the forms, and the B-52 was carrying a lifting body under the wing, and it was to launch at the same time as a satellite was going to be launched at Vandenberg. And so they taxied down the runway. There was colonels and everybody there, big deal. And he ran down there, and I thought they're going to take off. It's going to be okay. All of a sudden, he turned around, he came back, and I thought, oh, they decided I'm going to be court-martialed and shot. I can just tell it now. And they said, no, the weather is bad at Vandenberg. They can't launch the missile, so they can't fly the mission and drop the lifting body. And I was saved. I wasn't fired or court-martialed. So that's my Bobby Kennedy story. I'll never forget it.
I didn't know that you were a lieutenant. I was a mere E5.
I became a captain later.
Did you really? Okay.
Handed them out like chiclets.
John Marshall, can you contribute to this discussion?
I was a 26-year-old kid, newly hired when they went all news at KFWB, and on that night they asked me to go to the embassy ballroom and cover the story, and I did, and everything was fairly normal until I didn't hear shots. I was over on far stage right, the other side of the ballroom, but I did hear women screaming. And that was the first sign I knew something was wrong. That's what you must have heard, and getting Larry's radar going. And I spent the rest of the night covering it there. I won't bore you with a lot of stuff you've already heard from a lot of other people who were also experienced this. But there were a few quirky things that gave it kind of made it an unusual experience for me. I happened to turn on the radio a little after 1 o'clock when Frank Mankiewicz said Robert F. Kennedy is dead. And I knew, here we go. The KFWB called, they said, you're on the first flight in the morning. I get on a United flight, and we're taking off. And I look out the window, and there is Air Force One landing to come get the body. That's quirky situation number one. I was at LaGuardia when the body arrived, about 5 in the afternoon. there, and I covered the story as best I could. And then it was St. Patrick's Cathedral. They had the viewing of the body. You saw a shot in the video, the big wide shot of the flag-covered coffin. One unusual thing that happened was Teddy Kennedy came to visit or to pay his respects. But unlike the others, Larry O'Brien, I noticed, came in the side door of St. Patrick's Cathedral, and he stood there and prayed and so on. But Kennedy decided to get in line out front and wait his turn with all the other people. It wasn't clear whether the other people knew who was in front of him or behind him, but when he got to the casket, he stopped and paid his respects and then left. That was kind of an unusual, uncovered little angle. The next day was the funeral mass itself, which those who were around in those days, you remember how touching it was. After that, we went down to Grand Central Station. We, meaning all the reporters. Everybody was going to be on the funeral train. It was all organized. And we thought it was just going to be a train ride down to Washington, D.C. for the burial. Well, when you leave Grand Central, it comes out of the Hudson to a bridge, and we look out the window and we see the John F. Kennedy tugboat draped in roses with the crew saluting the train we're on. And that was just the beginning. Most of you remember the coverage of the story. We had no idea this was going to happen. It just was a spontaneous thing. To me, it's always moving to think about it. Whenever people say, "I love you," I always find it deeply moving because it's so rare. And this was monumental. Every mile, even out in the suburbs, big cities, as the train came through, there were people who were expressing their love in any way they thought they should. You know, flowers or signs and so on. We finally get to Washington for the burial. And I should probably mention that Ethel Kennedy and the kids came through the train and shook the hand of every reporter who was there. It was my first really big league experience. Dan Rather, for example, was just across the aisle. But she was so gracious, came through and thanked us for being there. That night, the funeral took place at Arlington, and everybody else afterward had ended the ordeal. They wanted to go back to the Shoreham Hotel where the rest of us, or where we were staying. I wanted to go home to my wife. So I called American Airlines. They put me on the next flight. It was out of Baltimore, Friendship Airport. And I walk up to the counter and I look up and see it's kind of a milk run with several stops. This aircraft was going to go to Memphis, Dallas, and Los Angeles. I called Joan. I said, "I don't know whether I should get on this plane." She said, "Don't do it." Well, I did. And those are my memories, my little unusual, quirky experiences. But it was quite an ordeal. As Boris well knows, it was a very historic, probably the most historic thing that I was directly involved with. In the later years, I covered a lot of news, but this one was probably the most touching, the most difficult. And thanks for listening.